Last week I spoke on contentment, and I encourage you to be content. That when we are discontent, it robs us of our joy, and that's been sort of our theme this year, that being discontent robs us of our joy. And I've been encouraging you to be content with whatever God has provided you. Stop wanting more and more. Stop complaining about what it is that you've already received. And this week now I'm going to encourage you to be discontent. I think you should be discontent about certain things. And because some things are definitely not a gift from God. They are more a product of man's own sinfulness. There are things that we must stand opposed to. And so I'm going to talk about three specific issues. I think that these three issues are very close to the heart of God. Because if you read through the Old Testament, if you look at all the prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets, these are three issues that come up over and over again. If you look at the writings of the early apostles, of Paul and John and James and all the rest of them, what you'll see are these three issues coming up over and over again. So these are three issues, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that are very near and dear to the heart of God, and things that we must not be content with. We must not sit back and go, well, don't rock the boat. Well, let's not make things work. These are things that we need to stand, I believe, opposed to. And I want to take a look at the very first issue, which is we should be discontent about civil rights. Oops, too far, see? First off, it says in the Bible, it says in Proverbs 31, 8 through 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. We have an obligation to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for those who are helpless, for those who are defenseless. Many times throughout the Old Testament, when you read the Old Testament prophets, time and again it says we need to take care of those who are widows and orphans, because these were the two classes of citizens within that society who had no voice. Because unfortunately in those times, women were perceived as property, children were perceived as property, and without a father or a husband to take care of them, they had no rights, they had no voice. Oftentimes, the widows were forced to turn to prostitution to support themselves. Orphans were left out on the street. Oftentimes, they would starve to death because there was nobody to take care of them. And God spoke to the people and said, these are the people that you must take care of. You must speak up. You must support those who cannot take care of themselves. Because we human beings are so diverse, there is no end of minority groups. There will always be a majority group, and there will always be some minority group out there who has nobody to advocate for them. And we seem to have this strange mentality in our society that majority rules, or that whatever the majority writes, that's what's good, or whatever the majority wants, that's what's fair. However, the majority is not always right. I have some great examples of how the majority is not always right. Think about the Israelites. As they traveled onto the promised land, remember, it was the majority who turned around and go, let's go back to Egypt. They weren't right. It was the majority who decided, hey, let's build a golden calf. And they weren't correct. It was the majority that when they reached the edge of the promised land go, nope, too difficult, let's go home. The majority is not always right. Sometimes because we live in America and we live by majority rules, we think that's the only way there is, and that's the only right thing. But in Christianity, we are called to defend the rights of the minority. We are called to be the voice for those who have no voice. Majorities have a tendency to oppress minorities, and the reason why is because they can, because nobody is there to speak out against it. However, we are called to speak up for those with no voice. We're called to speak on behalf of the oppressed. The church needs to become the leader in civil rights, not the begrudging follower who jumps on the bandwagon at the last minute after the struggle is already over. We need to be the ones who start the civil rights issues. Too many times the church has fallen on the wrong side of history in supporting minorities. If you ask people inside the church, if you go to a bunch of nice church people, go to any church down the street and you ask them, what would you say your impression of the church is? What's your perception of the church? And they'd say, oh, the church is love. It's a collection of loving people who have gotten together. But go outside the church and ask people who don't attend church, ask people who are not members of the church, and you know what they're going to tell you? They're going to say that the church is bigoted and hateful. There seems to be some kind of disconnect in which the church is perceived. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we correct this perception? How do we change that? We have to start by protecting the rights of those who are different from us and those with whom we disagree. And that's not always easy to do. Oh, I'll admit there's some groups out there I'm like going, I don't like who you are, and I don't like what you believe, and I don't like the things you say. But I have to protect them. I have to make sure that their rights are taken care of, because that is what I'm called to do. The kingdom of heaven is a kingdom of equality. There is no class structure within the kingdom of heaven. There is no hierarchy within the kingdom of heaven. There is no minority in the kingdom of heaven, and there is no majority in the kingdom of heaven. There is simply equality in the kingdom of heaven. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Paul describes the kingdom as having no Jews, no Greeks, no slaves, no free, no males, no females, because there are no second-class citizens in the kingdom of heaven. Oh yes, Paul had to live in cultures that had this stratification, that had these different levels of who was important and who's not. But he said, when you enter into the kingdom of heaven, all of that hierarchy is gone. Equality for all is a Jesus value that we should be supporting. First, we could start by perhaps giving more equality to women. In our country, equal pay for equal work hasn't quite caught up. And we as a church should be saying, this is wrong. Many women in other countries are still looking to get their basic rights. There are still some countries today where women are not allowed to be educated, and they do not have all the rights or the equality of men. And we as a Christian should be saying this is wrong. We should be encouraging other nations to bring equality to the women there. There are still countries where political dissidents, simply because they have different views in their government, simply disappear. And we as a church should be saying, where did they go? Where are they? And this is not right. We cannot sit comfortably in our free country and say nothing about it. In our own country, migrant workers are still exploited, and we need to do something about that. It's time to take time to educate yourself on civil and human rights. Hopefully, God will lay on your heart one issue, and then you can do all you can to learn about it and to speak on behalf of that issue, so that you can give voice to an individual who has no voice, so you can empower somebody who has no power. Then the church will be acting as a force for good that God has called us to be. And then the perception of who we are will be different. I oftentimes make mention of a letter that was written to a Roman emperor. The Romans had a hard time with the Christians. They were different. They were the minority. And sometimes they persecuted the Christians. Let's drive them out. Let's get rid of them. And the Roman emperor received a letter from a governor, and he said, we can't get rid of Christians. That would be a bad idea. Because if we did, who would take care of our sick? Who would man our hospitals? Who would take care of our poor? Who would feed our hungry? Because at that time, that's what the Christian church did. It took care of the sick and the poor and the hungry. It fulfilled a role that the government did not do. The letter stated to the emperor, Christians are too valuable. We can't get rid of them. Wouldn't it be a great thing if we could return to that, where our society perceived us as being too valuable to get rid of because we're too busy taking care of the poor and the sick and those who are disenfranchised and those who are oppressed? Would not that be a great thing if we could change the perception of us? The next thing that we have to look at, and this is frequently mentioned in the Bible, are courtrooms. We need to be discontent about unfair courts. Over and over again, within the major and minor prophets, the prophets come to the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, and they say, you have corrupted the courts, and this is why you are being disciplined. You have corrupted our court system. The courtroom is often where oppression plays out against those without a voice. We must always hold our judges to the highest possible standards. There should never be a time when the wealthy receive a different kind of justice than the poor. And yet we can sit here in our own country, and time and again we can comment about it, that it seems that you can have the best justice that you can afford. And those who can afford more seem to get a better form of justice. You know, the United States has made great progress in this area. We really have. I oftentimes describe the United States court system as sort of like Noah's Ark. Well, Noah's Ark on about day 39, right? It sure does smell bad, and it might be full of something unpleasant, but it's still the best thing afloat. We have a great court system compared to a few other countries, but we still have a lot of work to do. You know, we have legal representation for anybody who wants or needs it, but we still have work to do. You know, California suffers from a glut of lawyers. Walk out the door and you'll probably trip over one. We have just too many. We create too many. May I suggest a few ideas for all those extra lawyers that we have? Maybe they need to change their focus. Maybe they need to become civil rights attorneys. Maybe they need to become human rights lawyers. Maybe they need to become defenders and advocates for the poor and disenfranchised. You won't make any money doing it, but at least you'll be doing great ministry and doing the work that God has called the church to do. How great would that be that not one person has ever gone without great representation within the court? Here's another suggestion. I think we need to change the philosophy of our court system. The United States court system is an adversarial system. You had two adversaries, right? The prosecution and the defense. And they are there to win. And they'll do anything to win. Perhaps we should no longer have an adversarial system. What if both sides came there and said, let's see if we can find the truth? The truth is often hard to find, but with two sides working together to uncover what's really true, maybe we'll have better justice. And with honest judge, maybe we'll have better mercy. We as voters must stay aware of judicial impropriety, and we need to hold our judges responsible. I think it's kind of funny, every few years we have to go to the polls, and oftentimes we have to vote for judges, and most of us, myself included many times, have no idea who these people are. And so we just, yes, 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 yes. That's the way we vote. Or maybe you're to the contrary, and you're like, no, 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 no. Yeah, whichever way you happen to vote. But how many of you have taken the time to find out, is this a good judge? Is this a fair judge? We need to start getting involved and thinking about who we put into that courtroom. Are they doing the things that they should? Are they just? Are they fair? And then holding them accountable. Judges and courtrooms have power over people's lives, and that abuse of power grieves God. Time and again, he sent his prophets to the nations of Israel and Judah and said, you have corrupted my courts. That is why I am disciplining you. It grieves God's heart to see oppression in the courtroom. We as Christians must make sure that that power in the courtroom is wielded fairly, justly, and with mercy. And then finally, I want to talk about the stickiest issue of all. I think this is a very difficult issue for a lot of us, and it's the issue of the poor. We need to be discontent about the poor. The verse here says, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the seventh year, the year of release is near, and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land. There's an interesting little phrase in here about the seventh year, and a lot of people kind of don't get that. Oftentimes, people, in their own selfishness, didn't want to loan out things unless the seventh year was close. In Israel, the rule was that on the seventh year, everything you loaned got returned to you. If you sold a piece of land, it got returned to you in the seventh year. So everything was temporary. So some people would be like, well, the seventh year is only a month away, so okay, here you go, knowing that you were going to receive it back right away. And he's saying, don't be like that. Don't begrudge anybody like that. Open wide your hand. Be generous in all that you do. I think one of the problems that we have when we think about the poor is we tend to think only about the guy by the side of the freeway with the sign. And we look at that person and we go, well, they're probably a drug addict or an alcoholic, and I don't want to support that. I don't want to condone their sin. I don't want to give them anything like that. But that's only one aspect of poverty. There are many aspects to poverty. There are the working poor. There are many folks out there who are trying as hard as they can, working minimum wage jobs, and they just can't get ahead. I think if you talk to anybody who works 40 hours a week at minimum wage, and you really get to know them, you'll find out how hard it really is to do that. They're kept poor by predatory lending practices. Many of you are probably not aware that in certain areas of this country, the interest rate is broken down by geography. That if you go into the slums or the ghettos of this country, the interest rate there is higher than any place else. And so when they need a loan or they have to use a credit card, it ends up putting them deeper into debt. That's not right. Housing practices. They may not be able to afford housing. And so oftentimes they're forced into slum conditions where the rent is exorbitant for what they're receiving. And that keeps them poor. We have a system within our society that keeps poor people poor. And time and again, God sent the prophets to say, you have oppressed the poor, and this is why I'm disciplining you. This is an issue that is close to God's heart. He says, you are not to oppress the poor. Many people sit and they say, well, the poor people are poor because, well, they kind of did it to themselves, They're poor because of the way they treat their money, or they didn't take advantage of all the opportunities they had. And it's easy to say that as we sit in our comfortable middle-class surroundings, but the reality is they didn't have all the opportunities that we had. Oftentimes the schools they attend are underfunded. They receive lesser education than we receive. They don't have the same job opportunities that we have. Most of the time when one of us gets a job, it's because of somebody we know. It's the connections that we have. They don't have those same connections. They don't have the same opportunities that we have. I think oftentimes we need to say to ourselves, there but for the grace of God go I. Many of us were born in very fortunate circumstances where we received good educations, where we had good connections, and those have helped us along to continue our lifestyle. If we were in different circumstances, where would we be? The question is, how can I help the poor? Because, I want to help the poor, but I don't want to encourage all those nasty druggies. And I get that. I understand what you're saying. But how can we help the poor? Here's a few ideas. Why don't we start with the predatory lending practices? We need to stop these predatory lending practices. We need to petition Congress and say, hey, make this illegal because it keeps poor people poor. I don't know if any of you have ever been forced because of your circumstances to take out a payday loan, but let's face it, that's just legalized loan sharking. The interest rates on payday loans are far and above anything you would pay on a standard loan that any of us would probably take out. We're talking sometimes as high as 25, 30%. You need a short-term loan, you're going to end up paying 30% on it. That keeps poor people poor. We should make that illegal. What if Say one of the wealthiest banks in the world, the Vatican Bank, opened up branches where they would give loans at low percentage to the poor. What about if the Vatican Bank opened up branches everywhere that would cash checks without charging a huge fee for it, for those without bank accounts? What if every church in America, that any poor person could walk into any church in America and cash a check without having to pay a fee? What if in every church in America, any poor person could come in and get a microloan, a payday loan, with no fee? That would begin to help bring them out of this cycle of poverty that they get stuck in. What if all the churches of America got together and opened their own bank and made it a priority to keep the interest rates low, especially in the impoverished areas? We're going to give a huge loan. Why don't we give it to the multi-billionaires and charge them a huge rate of interest? Why do they get a better interest rate than everybody else? They can afford it. Like I said, perhaps maybe all the churches should just band together to create micro-loan centers with reasonable rates, check cashing services. What about food and housing? You know, one of the things that I'm really happy about, our church, through our More funds, on a regular basis supports Christian Outreach and Action, which runs basically a soup kitchen and a food pantry. 7 days a week, 3 meals a day, they're out there serving meals. And we're lucky enough to be part of that. Let us continue to support soup kitchens. Let us continue to support food pantries. These are safety nets for people who are hungry. Perhaps a great ministry opportunity would be to open a food store in an impoverished area. If you go into the slums, if you go into the ghetto areas, finding a supermarket is almost impossible. Many of them are the smaller markets that charge very high prices for the foods that are there. What a great ministry would be if some denomination, some huge denomination would just say, you know what, I'm going to go into the slums here and I'm going to open a supermarket and we're going to keep the prices low so that people can come in and get reasonably priced food, healthy food for a good price. It's difficult when you're impoverished because you face obstacle after obstacle that will drain away your limited resources. If the church were to step in and begin to set up new resources for them to help bring them out of this situation, we would be a force for good in the world today. I admire the work of one megachurch. It's in Santa Fe Springs. I'm sorry, the name has slipped my mind. But what they did was they bought an entire apartment complex that just happened to be next to their church. And they use it to house those who are impoverished. They take care of the building. They charge very reasonable rent, lower than many other areas, so that those who are poor and have families have a place to live. Wouldn't it be great if every church looked around and said, you know, let's start buying up some apartment buildings? We missed an amazing opportunity in 2008 when the housing market crashed. Churches should have been buying up properties and saying, let's start housing the poor, rather than letting them sit vacant and degrading themselves. I think probably the greatest thing about this housing apartment that they bought is that many of the families who live there, they're not required to be members of the church. They're not required to go to that church. They're not even required to be Christians. It's just an outreach to society. How great is that? What kind of message does that send to our society that says, hey, we as Christians care about you even if you are different from us? I know many churches that offer free auto mechanic service to anybody who needs it. People can bring in their cars, and the auto mechanics within the denomination there offer free services. I know many churches that offer free tax services to keep people out of trouble with the IRS. If you're sitting here today, you can start saying to yourself, what service can I offer? What service can I offer? What talent, what skill do I have? What is my job? And I can now offer it to somebody else if it would help them out. Throughout the very turbulent history of the Israelites, not only did they fall into idolatry time and time again, but they fell into the oppression of others. They corrupted their court systems. They oppressed the poor. And when God judged the nation of Israel, when he judged the nation of Judah, when his prophets came and they spoke to those people, God told them, I'm disciplining you because of these things. Not only for your idolatry, but for your corrupt courts and for your oppression of the poor. Because those things grieve God's heart. Now, some of you might be going, well, RC, you keep talking about Old Testament. You keep talking Old Testament. And I know you're all about, that's the Old Covenant stuff, right? We're under a new covenant. Does this still apply to us? And I say, yes, it does. Because what did Jesus teach us? He said the two greatest commandments were to love the Lord thy God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And the second greatest commandment was like the first, to love your neighbor as yourself. Is taking advantage of your neighbor loving him? Is keeping him oppressed or poor loving him? I don't think so. If you're sitting there going, well, they're not really my neighbor, then I will point out the story of the Good Samaritan to you. Because when somebody asked, who's my neighbor? Jesus said, anybody who was in need. Wouldn't it be great if the church were known for love? We claim within our own circles to be known for love, that we're a loving church, but wouldn't it be great if outside of these doors, if outside in the community in general, that we are known for love? Wouldn't it be great if the church was known for social justice? That every time there was an issue of injustice, the church was there first. Wouldn't it be great to be known as a supporter of human rights? That if throughout the world, whenever there was a human rights violation, the church was there first, saying this is wrong. Wouldn't it be great if the church were known for helping the poor? Wouldn't it be great if the church was known for helping the needy? Wouldn't it be great if the church was known for helping the defenseless and the oppressed? See, if we take on these issues which are so near and dear to the heart of God, then perhaps people will stop thinking of the church as outdated and no longer necessary. And they will perceive it for what it's supposed to be, the transforming agent of our society. We begin by transforming ourselves. And through the good works that we do in the world, we transform society. These are things that God cares about. It's very interesting. The last thing I want to share is this. Jesus cared about these things deeply. He said in the end times, he said it's going to be like a king who comes back. It's going to be like the separation of the sheep and goats. He's going to separate the righteous from the unrighteous. He's going to turn and he's going to look at the unrighteous and he's going to say, depart from me. You never knew me. Because I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was poor, you didn't take care of me. I was in prison, you didn't visit me. They're going to go, well, when did that happen? We didn't see you. He's going to say, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. It's not how did you treat the middle class. It's not how did you treat the rich and the wealthy. It's not how did you treat the person sitting in the pew next to you. It's the least of these, the outcast, the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the poor. How did you treat them? Because whatever you did to them, that's what you did to me. Then he turns to the righteous and he said, hey, welcome to the kingdom. Because I was hungry and you fed me. I was poor and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. When did we do that, Lord? And he says, whatever you did to the least of these, you did it to me. When we leave this morning, we need to start thinking to ourselves, Lord, point out the least of these so that I may serve you in serving them. With that, let's pray.